So, welcome everybody, and thank you very much for joining us. I think this is a very interesting topic that we're addressing, women rising, empowering the women of Pakistan and Afghanistan. My name is Jacqueline Bhabha, and I'm a human rights lawyer, and I'm based at the Harvard School of Public Health. And I'm really delighted that we are having this conversation at the moment. I think I just want to make two preliminary points, and then I'll just explain how we'll organize this event. So one is that I think many of us who spend most of our time here in the US and read the New York Times and so on are caught between this sort of double bind when we think about, for example, empowering women in Pakistan and Afghanistan. On the one hand, we are fed the story of enormous vulnerability and rights violations, Malala being one example, of course, the outrageous, events against Afghani girls being other examples. So we're constantly exposed to the sense of a vulnerable, rights violated community. But on the other hand, I think those of us who work on rights issues are also aware of a tremendous tradition of resilience and of organizing. And I remember years ago when I was supervising a thesis at the law school, a student who was working on asylum claims. She was looking at the asylum claim of a Pakistani woman who'd been a victim of domestic violence, and the advocates for this woman had argued that she couldn't possibly be sent back to Pakistan because Pakistan was sort of like a barbaric place where women's rights were counted for nothing and where women really had no voice. And she was just outraged. She said, I spent the last 5 years working with the most amazing women and women's organizations in Pakistan, and I just cannot, in all honesty, put forward this view that Pakistan is a sort of desert of pathetic women victims. So I guess my first point is that there is this tension between, on the one hand, thinking about vulnerability and thinking about really extreme rights violations, but on the other hand, being aware that there is, of course, a vibrant tradition of activism, of feminism, and of sort of really quite now, I think, powerful advocacy that has come from within the region. So I think when we think about empowering or capacity building, we need to have we as people living in this domain have to have a certain modesty about our own goals and not assume that we are speaking about a complete tabula rasa. So that's, I guess, the first point. But I think the second point is that as we now confront very complicated transitional situation, I guess in both countries, and we'll hear more from our experts, gender assumes an increasingly central space in discussions about foreign policy, in discussions about security, a place which really is relatively new. I mean, if we'd been having this discussion 15 years ago, I guess before 9/11, really we wouldn't have associated gender issues with foreign policy or with security, but I think increasingly this connection is being made. And so it's very interesting to see how questions about women rising are not only questions about domestic violence and about denial of access to secondary education, but they are also questions about voice and about participation, about women being at the table, women having a political stake. So it's a very fertile and rich and fascinating set of issues, and I'm really delighted that the South Asia Institute in its wisdom has convened this meeting. We have a terrific crew, and we don't have a huge amount of time, so let me just explain how I think we're going to manage this. We want to really end as close to 5:30 as possible because our speakers have other commitments. What I think I'll do is I'll just introduce each of our speakers in turn. And I've asked him to speak for really 15 minutes, not more, so that we do have time for discussion. This is a relatively small group, so we'd really like to have back and forth. And there is a mic for those of you who want to make contributions or ask questions at the end. So that's how we're going to proceed. So our first speaker is sitting in the middle, the only man at the panel. But we should not assume that is in any way a detraction. So it's Dan Grant, who's the Deputy Assistant to the Administrator in the Office of Afghanistan and Pakistan Affairs. And he has a very long history of work in the region, a lot of it actually in Afghanistan, where he worked, he's been working really for over a decade. And I think he brings a set of different expertises to his post. So he's worked as an international affairs consultant, but he's also worked on a series of conflict and post-conflict challenges in a range of different regions. So Dan, thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to learning from you.
Oh, well, thank you very much, and thank you all for having me. I'd really like to thank the Southeast Asia Institute for taking the time to give us a chance to speak, both for myself and my associates here. Forgive me if I come across as dipping my head down to read from prepared text a little too often. I promise that isn't the norm. But some of the subjects that I will be covering from USAID's perspective about Pakistan and Afghanistan tend to be so detailed that it's good to be accurate. And so reference to notes is a positive in this instance. So I wanted to elaborate a little bit about what USAID, U.S. Agency for International Development, which some of you, I assume most are familiar with, but as a very, very brief précis, is what is generally conceived of as foreign aid administered by the United States government in close conjunction with the State Department. That is what AID does. And what sort of efforts we put forward to support women in Afghanistan and Pakistan, from health and education to economic development and political empowerment. And so I'll start first with Afghanistan and then move on to Pakistan. As had been mentioned earlier, a reference was made to an event involving a young woman in October of 2012, Malala Yousafzai. And she was struck down at age 15 by a would-be assassin because she had developed a reputation for becoming what some had considered stubborn. Stubborn because she refused to be intimidated, she refused to be terrorized, and she refused to let go of her principles of what she thought to be right. Her teachers, her community, and even her own family were regularly forced to navigate the edicts of the Taliban in her area in order to survive, including infamous bans on girls' enrollment in school. She refused to hide from these ultimatums. She refused to accept a future without books, without ambition, or without being able to pursue her own dreams. And she almost paid the ultimate price for it with her life. Now, in that same month, just across the border, Fareshta Abbasi spent long days studying for her law degree at Herat University. And she'd only returned home to Afghanistan a few years prior to that. Years before, realizing that her child wouldn't be able to thrive in a country that was in the grasp of the Taliban, her parents had fled across the border into Iran. Now, these two young women, divided by language, by community, by ethnicity, by citizenship, are similar in two fundamental ways. They both reside in South Asia generally, a region where a great many women have to traverse a chasm of inequality. And both are absolutely courageous in appalling adversity that I don't know I would be able to confront. And I'm certain that a great many of us would quail at the thought of what sort of courage it would take to do so. And so the work that USAID does, in large part, is to try and meet the standard that these women have set for courageousness and trying to do the right thing. So I'll go on and talk about Afghanistan specifically. Over the last decade, the world has witnessed incredible changes there. Life expectancy has increased by 20 years. 8 million students are enrolled in schools. Millions now have access to electricity where formerly there had been none. Independent media, which was completely dismantled under the Soviets and the Taliban, is vibrant. It's like mushrooms popping up after a rainstorm. It's something incredible. And Afghanistan has made more progress over the last decade, according to UNDP's Human Development Index, than in any other country on earth. In no other area is Afghanistan's transformation more self-evident than in the minds and hearts of the women and girls of that country. Millions of girls are now in school, a drastic shift from essentially zero 12 years ago in 2002. Thousands are working towards their degrees. Thousands of businesses are now owned by women, with more springing up every day. More than 25% of the Afghan parliament is female. 2.4 million Afghan women voted in this year's general election, and hundreds ran for provincial council seats. Now, USAID has supported the efforts of women and girls of Afghanistan to reclaim their rightful places in society by building the foundation they need to succeed, health and education, and in helping to construct ladders to successful careers in the business world, in the government, and civil society. USAID has trained thousands of midwives, helping drastically reduce child death and maternal mortality. We've trained thousands of female teachers. We supported community-based education to ensure that girls did not have to travel long and dangerous distances to attend classes. We supported the sustainable growth of university-level education for both men and women, including the establishment of technical and business degrees and support for the American University of Afghanistan. We've graduated hundreds of interns from the Women in Government Internship Program, provided loans and training to hundreds of women-owned businesses and female entrepreneurs, and created financial products specifically geared to women-owned agribusinesses. Now, this may seem technical, but it really is the technical things that are building blocks of any society to be successful. Now, it's true that much more remains to be accomplished. The gender gap in Afghanistan is expansive. It's one of the widest on this planet. Not enough women are in school, not enough women are studying for their degrees, not enough businesses are owned by women, not enough government decision makers are women. But I and we at USAID have the greatest hope that we can close this gap. As the international community and the Afghan government labored to rebuild a country that has been demolished by over 3 decades of conflict, a new generation of Afghans and Afghan women has matured. Now, these young Afghans, men and women alike, are now prepared to carry this mission forward. Women like Ms. Advocacy, who was the first Afghan to serve as a judge in the world's largest international moot court competition. She's currently working in Kabul as an advisor to the Ministry of Women's Affairs and hopes to be a role model for other female law students in all of Afghanistan. Women like Karima Dariz, who earned a master's degree with the support of USAID and now serves as the dean of Kabul Education University, training the next generation of educators in that country. Imagine 75,000 of these women. Only through these exemplars of behavior can the next generation of girls have an example to follow and see a promising future that they can emulate. Now, only when women take their rightful places in Afghanistan's government, civil society, and economy can the next generation of girls follow in their footsteps. The women of Afghanistan are courageous. The women of Afghanistan are ambitious. They're committed to taking the next step in their education, their careers, and fulfilling their rightful place in civil society. And so we at AID must do what we can to be just as courageous and just as committed and just as ambitious. And so that is why, and this is just recently announced and successfully launched, we've chosen to host the largest gender program in USAID's history called Promote. I'm curious if anyone's been made aware of this. Well, now you have your opportunity. It's a program that's focused solely on empowering Afghan women to take the next step in their careers and pave the way for girls who will follow them. It's designed to help 75,000 women achieve leadership roles in all parts of society, from business to academia to politics. It will work through 4 main components. First, for women's leadership. Development will provide women with leadership training, the vital soft skills that are necessary so as they can perform both jobs that are right in front of them, but also to rise to meaningful positions as their careers mature. The second is for women in government, which will work to increase the number who are serving in government positions at urban levels primarily, but with a focus on supporting career advancement, largely through the technical aims of facilitating women's entry into decision-making roles in the civil service, encouraging policy reform within the Afghan government at both the national and subnational levels, and increasing local stakeholder support for women in government. The third, women in the economy will do what it can to reduce barriers for women entering the workplace, particularly in non-traditional sectors such as technology, finance, and administration. A more competitive, more inclusive workforce will lead to a more competitive business environment and a more inclusive society. The key objectives of all this include improving businesses, vocational training, technical placement services for women, increased assistance, et cetera, with an aim towards their general advancement. And the fourth and final component are women's rights groups and coalitions that will be intended to strengthen and promote the collective action of women's rights groups in Afghanistan, which will amplify their impact. This component will strengthen the capacity and influence of women's activist groups and empower those groups to advocate for local and national laws and policies that will benefit women throughout Afghanistan. Now, this is not a one-time investment for Promote, but it's an enduring collective call to action for the United States government, for the private sector as well in investing in Afghanistan, and for the women of Afghanistan together. Now, bringing together these resources and the expertise of a range of partners, USAID has committed $216 million to Promote. And expansion is built into this program for others to continue donating to it, to where it could have an additional $200 million added in for a potential $400 million to be given to this. Donors will be able to buy in to this program through bilateral grants. Say if the Brits or the Canadians were willing to do so, USAID would welcome it and have matching potential USAID funds. We're also reaching out to the private sector to get involved. Businesses can leverage their assets to increase the impact of Promote through direct or in-kind assistance. And so with this, and on the cusp of a new presidential administration in Afghanistan, it's clear to me that despite the dozen years of American involvement in Afghanistan in its current stage, I believe that Afghanistan is entering a new era. It's an era of scholarship for Afghan students. It's an era of economic opportunity for Afghan entrepreneurs, women and men. It's an era of equality for all Afghans, young and old, urban and rural, and especially women and men. And I do not know the exact quote, but it is Ataturk, who is famous for having said a society cannot succeed if half of its population remains under constraint. And so it is true with Afghanistan. Today, we can see the astonishing gains that Afghan women have achieved since 2002, and they've directly contributed to the growing prosperity, which there is, and hope in their nation. And the Promote program will be based on these gains. That's sort of the centerpiece of what USAID has been working on, and this just recently had its official launch a few days ago, where Rajiv Shah, the director of all of the administrator, technically, of all of USAID, John Kerry's counterpart in USAID to the State Department, went there to help formally initiate this program along with the newly elected president, Ashraf Ghani. So that gives a sort of snapshot of what AID is doing. I will allow my colleagues to speak more about general terms with Afghanistan and Pakistan. As far as Pakistan is concerned, it'll be a little bit shorter, but no less important. Also because Pakistan is the area that I am directly responsible for in my office. In Pakistan, the struggle for women's empowerment goes all the way back to its founder, Jinnah, who famously said, no nation could rise to the height of its glory unless your women are side by side with you. It's fascinating that you have similar quotes coming from leaders. He continued to say that we're the victims of evil customs. It is a crime against humanity that our women are shut up within the four walls of the houses as prisoners. There's no sanction anywhere for the deplorable condition under which our women have to live. Jinnah said that. Now, since that speech 70 years ago, Pakistani women are more empowered and more emancipated than they have been previously. More and more women are entering the workforce, and yet they still face discrimination and harassment. Now, last month, the World Economic Forum released their annual Global Gender Gap Report, which measures the relative gaps between women and men across four key areas: health, education, economics, and politics. The report ranked 142 countries. Pakistan came in second to last, with 141 nominally beating out Yemen, and significantly behind other neighboring South Asian countries such as India at 114, Nepal at 112, and Bangladesh at 68. And yet, despite the overwhelming challenges and these cowing statistics, Pakistan has produced female leaders that serve not only as role models in their local communities and for Pakistan, but role models to young women as well within the country and for young men, both inside Pakistan and without. Women like the late Benazir Bhutto, who led the country twice as prime minister and gave her life while engaged in the most democratic of processes, simply campaigning for election. Women like Sharmeen Obaid Chinoy, who won an Emmy for her documentary Children of the Taliban and an Academy Award for her film Saving Face, about acid attack victims and the Pakistan Parliament's decision to pass a bill on acid violence. and Malala Yousafzai, whom I spoke about earlier and who won the Nobel Peace Prize earlier this year for her courage. So my takeaway for you is this. There's not just one woman of this sort. There are thousands of her, just like Malala Yousafzai in all of Pakistan, who make the decision to screw up their courage and go to school armed only with their desires to learn and to grow. Benazir Bhutto's 2 elections were not outliers. Women are represented in higher percentages in Pakistan's parliament than they are here in the United States Congress. It's only just now that the US Congress hit 100 female representatives for the first time in its history. Let's see, Pakistan's previous foreign minister, Rabbani Kar, was a woman. His previous ambassador to the US, Sherry Riemann, was a woman. And when Nancy Pelosi was Speaker of the House here in the United States, Pakistan had its own female Speaker of the National Assembly. Forgive me, my throat. Fatima Mirza. Now, our goal at USAID is to support the call to women's empowerment so that all of these females, these women embody. And so we do that in 2 ways. First, by integrating gender equality and women's empowerment into all of our programming in Pakistan, all of it. Now this serves, and this is, we have an annual budget right now that is running at $500 million a year for Pakistan. And so every single program has an element of women's empowerment built into it. Now this serves to increase opportunities for women's participation in the labor force, expand girls' access to quality basic education, improve maternal and child health, and promote women's rights in political, economic, and social realms. Secondly, we have programming exclusively dedicated to women's empowerment. In 2012, more than $100 million was attributed to actively reduce the gap between men and women in 2013, and then we spent an additional $79 million on the same programs. On the ground, what this translates into have been the following results. We've built back or rehabilitated over 75 girls' schools in Pakistan, many of them destroyed or attacked by the Taliban in Pakistan's northwest. We've sponsored almost 400 academically talented women to pursue higher education who otherwise could not have afforded it. We've strengthened domestic violence shelters to provide legal aid, psychosocial counseling, and job skills, and connected women to potential employers in these venues. This year, almost 1,000 women took refuge in these shelters. We've funded helplines for gender-based violence victims across the country and provided gender sensitization training for law enforcement, judiciary, public universities, and civil society organizations. And we've registered over 500,000 women for computerized national identity cards which allow them to vote, which is the greatest empowerment, to allow them to run for office and to obtain loans, money and power. Much more can be done, much more should be done, but it won't just happen in a vacuum and on its own. And so that is what USAID does. And hopefully we'll be able to continue along that trajectory, inshallah. Those are the remarks that I have, and could seem dry or perhaps a bit remote, but this is the one sector of the United States government, more than all, I would think, that does an unalloyed good in trying to do what we can for those who deserve the help that they've got coming to them. I take an enormous amount of pride in the work that I do, and I have the enormous good fortune to work with people who share similar sensibilities. And so I'm lucky to be doing the work that I do for the women and men of Pakistan and Afghanistan. And so I'm just grateful that I'm here to get a chance to talk about it with everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's a wonderful start, I think, to the discussion. You outline a very expansive, ambitious, and generous program of interventions in these 2 countries, spanning an enormous range of different fields of intervention. Really everything, as you say, in the program in Pakistan, you say gender really impacts on all the kind of, $500 million that the US has allocated for work there. So that's a really impressive agenda and set of goals. We're now going to switch focus, and we're very lucky to have with us somebody who speaks on behalf of the NGO community, and who actually is from Afghanistan and who works on and with Afghani women. So Parnian Nazary is the advocacy manager at Women for Afghan Women in DC, which is a human rights organization which operates 28 centers in Afghanistan, which I'm sure we'll hear a little bit more about. And Parnian herself, I think, as Dan was saying, so many women are working in these countries with really indomitable courage. We hear the names and are familiar with the names of a few, but there are many, many thousands. And I think Parnian is clearly one of them who's for a long time worked on issues related to women's rights and education, really in the face of opposition from forces that we're all aware of. Before joining Women for Afghan Women, she worked at the Social Science Research Council, informing UN policies on the Middle East and North Africa. And before that, she worked at a range of different situations, including the Embassy of Afghanistan in DC, the Institute of International Education, and the American University of Afghanistan in Kabul. So, Parnian, thank you very much for being with us, and look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much for having me. So I have some brochures about my organization, which I will not be talking a lot about here, and you're welcome to share those. So thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to be here and represent Afghan women and celebrating the launch of Promote. It's a great program, and it was welcomed by the Afghan President Ashraf Ghani, who has put women's rights and empowerment as one of his priorities and was making remarks last week about Promote, and that was welcomed by our First Lady. So it's an amazing program. And I will talk to you about Afghan women's rights actually prior to 2001, their progress in the last 13 years, and how Promote will help us become more empowered in the future. So we are all familiar with images of Afghan women being covered with chadari, the long blue, white, or black burqa that covers women from head to toe. We are familiar with images of Afghan men with turbans, traditional piran tumban, beards, and with rifles and guns on their hands. And we are familiar with these images of war, devastation, oppression, and anger. But what most of us don't know, that it was not always this way. I was actually on a radio interview about a week ago with someone who called from Afghanistan and a retired general from the US. And two things that stick with me from that talk, which affected me actually. One was by this retired general who said that Afghans are uncivilized, so changing is difficult. And then it was on the occasion of the last British troops leaving Helmand province, which is very heavily, there's the Taliban influence, and said that when the foreign troops leave, a lot of these bases are taken over by the Taliban. They are filled in by the Taliban, and the man calling in from Afghanistan was saying this. So this makes me a bit scared about what's going to happen. I want to highlight that what actually the media is doing a very good job of focusing on the very negative images and negative news. And I want to highlight what the popular media does not usually cover. So in Afghanistan, until the conflict of the 1970s during the Cold War, the 20th century had seen relatively steady progression for women's rights. Afghan women were first eligible to vote in 1919, only a year after women in the UK were given voting rights, and a year before the women in the United States were allowed to vote. In the 1950s, Parda, gender segregation, was abolished. In the 1960s, a new constitution brought equality to many areas of life, including political participation. The first group of Afghan women who were sent for higher education to Turkey on scholarships was in 1928. And the doors of universities and schools had remained open for Afghan women up until 1990s. King Zahir Shah and Queen Umaira spoke in front of a crowd in Washington, D.C. in 1968 and were welcomed by President John F. Kennedy. And the video is on YouTube. I encourage you to watch that and see how chic this queen was. We Afghan people have these beautiful images of the past, and we are hopeful that we can make things better in the future. But during the coups and Soviet invasion occupation in the 1970s, through civil conflict between Mujahideen groups and government forces in the 80s and 90s, and then under the Taliban rule, women in Afghanistan had their rights increasingly rolled back. The darkest period for Afghanistan in general, and especially for women, was the 5 years of the Taliban rule from 1996 to 2001. I was 10 years old and lived in Kabul when the Taliban came to power. They denied, among all the terrible things they did, which we have seen lots of images of it, and a lot of us should be familiar with them. They denied education to all girls. Schools, they closed down the schools, and they became a space for internally displaced peoples, or they used it as checkpoints for the Taliban. So I was hungry for education, and I started looking for alternative ways to a formal education. I went to 2 underground schools, and each was discovered by the Taliban. And one occasion I was sitting in the class with other girls when they barged in the class, beat the teachers, closed down the school, and told us we cannot go there anymore. I went to English language center, and the teacher of, the head of that course was our friend, and I said, I'm gonna cut my hair like a boy, short, and wear boys' clothes, but please let me come and learn. He was scared. He said, I have Taliban in my classes, and if you came in and they find out, we are both gonna be in trouble. And it wasn't uncommon in such cases for the teacher and a student who were committing a crime to go to jail, actually. So I was disappointed, and I stayed at home. But I was lucky that I come from an educated family, and they homeschooled me. I learned at home. After 5 years of this very, very difficult life, the Taliban government, they fell from power in 2001, and it was a celebration for me and my family and all the Afghans around me. In Kabul, Chowdhury was casted away. My 4 sisters' mother, we threw them in garbage. And schools reopened immediately, even though it was winter, which is usually vacation in Afghanistan, but they opened the schools immediately. And during the Taliban, there were no girls at the schools, but now there are millions of Afghan girls enrolled in the schools, as Dan mentioned before, and thousands of them have graduated from colleges and universities. So the bases are there. We have a lot of high school graduates now, and it's time now to focus on quality, and it's a new stage for Afghanistan. In the years that followed the Taliban, we Afghan women who had suffered tremendously under the Taliban rule started our fight for equal rights more passionately than ever. In terms of employment now, tens of thousands of women work as government employees, teachers, journalists, doctors, engineers, business owners, and many other public and private sectors. Prior to 2001, political participation for Afghan women was non-existent. But today, women make up 28% of Afghanistan's parliament. That's higher than the US Congress, where it was at 18% last year, just before these elections. Afghan women have served as governors, district governors, and many other high-profile positions since 2001. Afghan women have taken the lead in organizing themselves as part of the growing Afghan civil society and fighting for their rights. In the past couple of weeks, we had two cases. Just I'm giving you an example of women for Afghan women that were on New York Times. A 10-year-old girl was raped by a mullah in Kunduz in May, and my organization brought the woman to Kabul, and about 10 days ago was the hearing, and the court decided that the mullah would go to jail, was sentenced to 20 years in prison. And it was really groundbreaking that the defenders of the mullah were saying to use Sharia law, which would have treated this case as adultery, and would have just the mullah and the girl would have been beaten 100 lashes. But our lawyers worked really hard to say that's not going to happen. We should use civil law, and this is a case of rape, and the girl is a victim, And finally, we won the case. And it was the first man who went to prison for 20 years for this crime. And this is such a change from the time of the Taliban. When I lived there, I was beaten on the street, and not just me, lots of Afghan women, just for not wearing the right kind of clothes on the street, just not covering myself fully. I was beaten with lashes, and I ran in tears home and went in hiding. And the government was doing that. There was no one to get help from. And now, women who are raped, who are abused, they at least have these hotlines to call. They have pro bono lawyers that, for example, Women for Afghan Women provide them. We have opened the first shelters in Afghanistan, and just from my organization, 28 are operating in 10 provinces of Afghanistan. So this is change. And but despite this immense progress, the gains made so far remain extremely fragile. With the US-led coalition forces scheduled to leave by the end of 2016, many Afghan women question if their gains can be sustained. I was in Afghanistan in February and March of this year, and the one common sentiment among all Afghan women is their shared fear of being abandoned by the international community, while the Taliban and insurgency groups continue to threaten our hard-won gains. But despite the increasing targeted attacks on Afghan women and all the disruptions that we faced from insurgency and other groups, it has not stopped Afghan women from joining security forces, from going to school and serving as public officials. While women are on the front lines of fighting for their rights, their success also depends on the continued support of the international community and the government of Afghanistan. So I'm hopeful. I welcome the launch of Promote, which gives us and Afghan women more hope that we will continue to have the US and international support behind us in the years to come. I especially welcome the, if I'm wrong with the number, please correct me, with the 7,000 scholarships that will become available to Afghan women through Promote. And I know women who have received these scholarships who have gone back or served. I actually received a scholarship in 2003 and was one of the first women who got a scholarship and came to study abroad in the US. And I know many of them who have went back or stayed here, and they are very active. I have a dinner for Afghan women in DC and Virginia area to advocate together, to work together on these issues. And I just had so many emails from Afghan women who wanted to join, and they are passionate and they are very dedicated, that I actually didn't have enough space for all of them. And that's amazing. That's a great change. Education is power, and I hope that through this Empower program, more and more Afghan women will be in positions of power and will become more involved in decision-making process. I'm also hopeful with the new government. We, as just the first female judges going to be appointed to the Supreme Court for the first time by Ashraf Ghani. And the first lady, actually, the last first lady who was this active was, I think, in 1920s and 30s. And this first lady is in public, and like President Karzai's wife. And I've met with our organization and has welcomed our work. And I'm hopeful with all of this.
Thank you. That was really a fascinating and very encouraging presentation. It's amazing to hear from you that 28% of parliamentarians in Afghanistan are women. So it really goes back to the point I made earlier that really, on the one hand, we do have this image of desperate need and oppression and discrimination, but on the other hand, it's very inspiring example of female empowerment. So that's wonderful, and of course we all wish you all the best and congratulate you on your own personal courage, but also on this vision of creating centers where Afghani women can really realize their aspirations. It's a wonderful development. Okay, so last but not least, we have Kanwal Bokhary, who is the Economic Growth Advisor at USAID's mission in Pakistan. she too, like Dan, has a very long history of experience of working on in the development sector and has had a series of different senior positions. She now is responsible for managing growth programs and for she works particularly on technology and the relationship between technology and business in the Pakistani context, sort of linking and networking between the private sector and government programs. She advises the USAID mission on a range of economic, financial, and business-related reforms and implications. And amongst other things, she has spearheaded Pakistan's first public-private partnership in relating to mobile technology, designing a partnership with Telenor, which maybe she'll say more about, to increase mobile information and financial services to small and medium enterprises, something that is increasingly being used, of course, in many countries, and something that, of course, also has huge implications for women and women's empowerment. So thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to your comments.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me and giving me an opportunity to speak. I will primarily focus on the situation with regard to economic empowerment of women in Pakistan, the challenges that they are facing, and the interventions that USAID has sort of initiated, and some of the results of those interventions, and what is it that we would want to do in future in the economic growth space. This morning, as we were sipping our orange juice at breakfast and thinking about a hectic schedule ahead, thousands and thousands of miles from Boston, somebody had just woken up to the sound of cockcrow in a Jahania, a very small village in Pakistan. That person also has a very busy schedule today. Her name is Bholi, meaning the innocent. Bholi is only 17. On her frail shoulders, she'll be carrying the weight of this day and the weight of all her yesterdays. Bholi cooks, does the dishes, washes clothes, feeds the cattle, prepared cow dung for fuel, run errands, carries round her polio-stricken 7-year-old brother, looks after her other brothers and sisters, sings and plays with them, bathes them, feeds them, day in and out. That is Bholi for you. Surely there must be some incentive, you may ask, some reward, some recognition for all this. If nothing else, perhaps a smile of approval, a pat on the shoulder every now and then. Those who care to look at her closely find a small, ugly mark on her forehead, where she parts her hair. She's been carrying it since she was 4, when she came in her mother's way and fell accidentally. At least this is what the mother told everyone later. Wrapped in her father's anger and her mother's frustration, Bholi grew up to live with it all. She was also made to accept many things about herself, that she was a cumbersome responsibility, never to be let out of the house alone, that she would never be as valuable as her brothers, that whatever work she did in the house, all girls were supposed to do, that she would never be sent to school like her brothers, that she would always eat after they have finished, and that she was a shameful burden on her father to be got rid of with a hefty dowry, married off to a tyrant, to bear his children and to serve him all her life. She was the cause of all things bad. She would get her just desserts. She was a girl. On July 23rd, 2011, something happened. Bholis happened to be visiting at her cousin's place, who lived in a nearby village. There were other young women of her age there, talking about things Bholi had never thought of before. A training workshop was being held under a USAID-funded project on skills development. Bholi liked what she saw and what she heard. She realized that women can be skillful and can also use their skills to generate income and thereby gain confidence and respect. In the evening, Bholi returned to her home. The same evening, for the first time in her life, she noticed how skillfully she was kneading the dough. Ladies and gentlemen, in Pakistan, women continue to face constraints due to the prevalent socio-cultural norms that deny them equal access to basic social services, just as health, education, and economic opportunity. Pakistan ranks 123 out of 148 on Gender Development Index 2012. I'll give you 3 statistics. Women are basically, they constitute almost 50% of Pakistani's population. Out of the total 3.2 million enterprises in Pakistan, only 3% are women-owned and women-managed. Proportion of women in the managerial and professional cadres is only 2.2%. Although men-operated small and medium businesses also face difficulties, but women-owned businesses face more challenges compared to men. And these include limited access to formal financing, marketing of their products, difficulties in adapting to newer technologies, mobility, limited access to skill development for themselves on their workers, lack of property rights. That affects not only access to finance, but also other dimensions of enterprise such as decision making, complicated procedures, and also that is a hindrance towards them getting access to finance because property is normally used as collateral. As a response to some of these challenges, USAID Pakistan took specific initiatives to economically empower women. And I'll highlight 3 out of them. We worked at the policy level by engendering the National Small and Medium Enterprise Policy, which before our intervention was completely gender blind. We built capacities of institutions that are key to private sector-led growth, particularly women entrepreneurs, and which included some women chapters of Chamber of Commerce and Industry. And we also helped create certain exclusive women chambers of commerce and industries and professional women's association. We also helped women entrepreneurs to increase profitability by 40 to 50% by improving their products, access to markets and finance, and improve business management skills. Rashida is a woman entrepreneur who has 5 children. Her food business was about to close down due to very unreliable market linkage and zero access to finance. With USAID's support, she was able to access better markets, create value-added products, and link up with financial institutions for credit. Today, she is running a very successful business. She has employed 9 more people. And I remember when I met her the last time, she told me, to quote, "I don't have to think about what I will feed my children anymore. Instead, I think about my children going to school and learning things I don't know. And it gives me real satisfaction that I am the source for employing other people. I now want to expand my business." And Rashida is one of 120,000 women who have benefited from USAID's assistance under Economic Empowerment Program. Going forward also, we plan to continue focusing on women's entrepreneurship by picking up sectors that are geared towards women employment and women entrepreneurship. Technology is one such sector which can give opportunities for women to get jobs and also to be self-employed and strengthen their businesses as it reduces mobility, distance, and information-related issues. I would end by urging you to think again about Bholi. Think through and you will see millions of Bholis behind that one character. Bholis that are waiting for us at the other end. Bholis we are trying to reach out to and rescue, as they do not only constitute half of the population, but also produces the other half. They are the future, and together we are building their future for Pakistan. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for those really thoughtful comments, which I think set out very well this complex picture that you're dealing with and the amazing work that you're part of building. So I wonder if I maybe can start off by just asking each of you a question, and then we'll open the floor for discussion and questions. So, and I'll just go in the order in which you presented. So, Dan, I wonder if you could start off first by talking a little bit about how you have a lot of experience in Afghanistan, and you're relatively new to Pakistan. And in Afghanistan, you presented this very encouraging vision of a country where there's been, the greatest progress according to the UNDP and so on. And in Pakistan, on the other hand, where we haven't had, decades of war, we have this very difficult situation, very low, really right at the bottom of the pile kind of ranking in terms of international indicators. So with your sort of dual experience, how do you see this? What lessons, for example, from the kind of, really dramatic strides forwards in Afghanistan do you bring with you and think you're going to build on, for example, in Pakistan? Or how do you see the relationship between these two neighboring countries where there's been such different circumstances, but also different rates of progress?
That's an excellent question. It's important to draw a distinction between the circumstances of each state, because it's easy to do an apples-to-apples comparison. Effectively, certainly since the early 1990s, the state cohesion in Afghanistan had collapsed. You had a series of coups in the 70s and political instability stretching even as far back as some part of the late 1960s. The Soviet invasion in 1980. And then the withdrawal of Soviet forces in 1989, at which point various mujahideen groups that had driven the Soviet army out fought among one another. And it effectively caused the disintegration of a great deal of the social fabric of the country, leading to warlordism, absence of rule of law, et cetera, et cetera. And I had directly encountered it in my time there. I'd spent 2 years in Afghanistan from 2002 to 2004, and then a lengthy period in 2009, and 1 or 2 trips after that, where people would tell me firsthand that because of the degree of chaos that had followed in the wake of the Soviet exit, basic knowledge about functioning parts of agriculture, of education, of engineering had fallen away. And it's not that people were any less intelligent, it was that the systems that would provide that sort of instruction deteriorated in the midst of anarchy. And so you would have farmers who would not be conscious of crop rotation for fertilization, that sort of thing. And so Afghanistan's recovery, a lot of it is due to re-implementation of a lot of the basics of human society into places that needed it the most, and hence the acceleration, which is a marvel. The degree of infant mortality has dropped dramatically as a result of this. Pakistan is far more complex, and a lot of it has been due to back and forth of political struggles between different groups, both at a national level but also at a subnational level from various provinces advancing different political aims and agendas. And so it has varied from one period of time to another as to what the rate of development has been. I am quite encouraged by a few recent developments in Pakistan. One, the first successful peaceful transfer of power from one party to another occurred in 2013, ever, since partition in 1947. There was a cohabitation government of 2 competing parties in the top 2 elected posts in the country, and then power was handed over. This was not remarked upon largely by the Western press. And secondly, Nawaz Sharif is criticized by some, but we have found a great deal of the policies that he has pursued are targeted towards the economic empowerment of Pakistan writ large, and that has an effect of empowering everyone in all sectors, improving educational gains for everybody, and it creates enough, as economic activity and opportunity increases, it pulls women in by natural gravity to do so. And this is demonstrably the case in what the government of Pakistan wants to pursue. Energy development, in order to have more electricity, in order to have more businesses that can function. Flood control, so you can have better agricultural output, so you can have less natural disasters that beset the country when monsoon seasons come through in the Indus Valley, in the Indus River Basin. It is true that both countries have a great a struggle to overcome in some of various sectors of development, but the sources for them are different. But we are quite hopeful. The United States government is investing a great deal of money in both, and it isn't for a charitable sense where we hope for the best. I mean, it's with great calculation as to where we think the best good can be done with the greatest potential outcome. Yeah, that's I can go on, and I have been. So
thank you very much. No, that's very interesting. Parnian, I wanted to just ask you. You mentioned in your comments that I think you said maybe I didn't jot it down, but you've rebuilt several of the, like 75 of the schools that were destroyed, or did you say by the Taliban? Or
All schools were closed down.
yeah,
and a lot
but
of
that
them
you've
destroyed.
rebuilt some spaces and so on. So I
Yeah.
wanted you to reflect a little bit on how you see things going forward, because of course the Taliban is still around, and there's a lot of discussion about, you know, what role it might assume, and clearly there's a lot of contestation. So your organization and you personally, how do you see this moving forward? How do you assess the sort of strength of this resurgence of civil society and of women's rights and so on in the current context?
I think where women are now and the civil society is now is very different from where we were in 1995 and 6 after the years of civil war. That the Taliban came and took control, and we also didn't really know what the Taliban was exactly. So people did not really resist them taking over. It was after years of chaos, and they were going to bring security and stability, and people didn't resist. But their rules were imposed one by one, and until it got really suffocating and terrible. But this time it's different. We know who the Taliban are. A lot of people, of course, there are people, young men without jobs, without education, who do join the forces. They get paid quite a lot by the Taliban as well, and then against that is a strong force. You know, it's like when you fall once, you get up stronger. So the women really crashed once, and they have gotten up a lot more stronger. I think that that it's never going to be how things were during the Taliban. But I do worry what it will look like. It's not going to be the same. There have been some, they've tried to integrate the Taliban into the system and reconcile with them. I don't see them changing in any way. They have continued to attack the schools. They have continued to burn the schools. I think in 2008, there were 206 attacks on education by the Taliban and other insurgency groups. And the insurgency group has gotten a lot more complex. There is the Haqqani group, there is this and that. It's got a lot more complex. So I think what does worry me is that the withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan in 2016 is premature. It's premature, it's too early. We have worked so hard to get where we are. And if there is a void, the Taliban are powerful. We see that. And I worry that they might take control of some areas. So.
Okay, no, thank you for that. That was very thoughtful. Kanwal, I just wanted to ask you, you talked about technology, and I know this is one of your particular expertises. Could you give us some sense, given the very kind of troubling gender score and the high rates of illiteracy still amongst, and sort of lack of educational access among women in Pakistan, how do you see, and I presume I know little about Pakistan, but if it's anything like India, that, you know, pretty spotty access, certainly to the internet, and even I'm not sure how widely diffuse, you know, mobile technology is. What do you think are the most hopeful avenues for mobile technology, specifically on the women rising kind of front?
Good. An excellent question. Thank you for that. Basically, as far as the mobile technology is concerned, Pakistan, although is a late entrant to the field of technology, but if you look at now, according to many studies, independent studies, ICT is one of the fastest growing sector in Pakistan, ICT, information, communication and technology. That's one of the fastest growing sectors in Pakistan. And right now it's sort of said that it's about growing about with 20 to 25% per annum. And I'll give you just one small figure, which is that we are basically a population of 180 million people. And as we speak today, there are 135 million mobile phone subscribers in Pakistan. So which means that the technology, mobile technology has reached even in the remotest areas. And of course, there are, it's a lot of women also have this, right? Have this mobile phones. I'm not saying that each and every woman has it, obviously, but a substantial number of women, they also have it. And so, and with this, and we just sort of, Pakistan also entered into the third and fourth generation of which is called 3G and 4G. I don't know, I don't want to sound very technical, but basically which means that a broadband wireless connectivity is there and people can sort of reach. So how it can help women is that because since the technology has reached to places, but the question is that are people, particularly women and people in general, making effective optimum use of technology to solve their problems, not just economic but also social and others? The answer is no. So there is still a lot of space. We have a lot of telecommunication companies, a lot of multinational companies, they are operating in this space. And then the finance is access to finance. We have a big problem in Pakistan, which is called financial coverage, financial exclusiveness, a big problem. Particularly only 16% of the population has access to bank accounts. So that, and for women it's even bad. So the partnership in terms of opportunities that your question was that we see a lot of telecommunication companies, 6, 7 of them, huge ones, partnering with the financial institutions. And so it's a win-win situation. The financial institutions get the outreach through their wide, 137 million mobile phone subscriptions, and the users, they get the financial inclusion. So which means that they can remit money, and they can also have access to sort of mobile wallets also. Another thing which, how it can help women in future is that basically some of the pilots that we've ran in Pakistan is that by using the SMS, which is short messaging services, certain messages can be remitted to women, not just by way of text, but also by way of pictures. And then, so it could be, again, we can go on and on, like SMS and then integrated voice response messaging and trading platforms and financial services. So, and that is something that's something that women can self-employ herself also if ICT, if she's familiar with ICT. But of course, the challenges, one of the greatest challenge is technology literacy, because that is something people may have mobile phones, but they may not know how to use it. So that's one of the area that we plan on doing, because they can do transactions also, can access markets and engage just by sort of using the mobile technology. Internet, yes, I think we don't have a lot of people who are internet. Now basically the big telecommunication companies are actually trying to make the internet available on mobile phones, which actually will really result in deep penetration as far as the availability of internet is concerned. But YouTube is banned in Pakistan. So I think that's something which US government is trying to address. And another thing that we want to address is technology and innovation also in research. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, so now it's over to you. Please put your hand up, and we have a circulating mic, and just say just one sentence about who you are and where you're located, and go ahead. So who would like to start? Yeah, 1 second, just wait for the mic, thank you.
My name is Hardeep. I'm first year in the PhD program in the history department. I work on modern South Asia, but primarily India. So one of the questions which I actually want perhaps all three of you to comment on, if you have something to say, is sort of this like underlying narrative which was apparent in all three of your comments, which is like this idea of economic development improving the gender question per se in Afghanistan or Pakistan. I'm also curious about other types of programs in relation to changing social and cultural attitudes towards women that either USAID or your NGO or in any other way are sort of making transformations in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. And the reason why I ask that is I also work on the gender question in India, and you see transformations in policies, you see economic development policies come in, but over time they don't lead to gender equity. And the West is a good example of that. You can have tons of money, it doesn't mean that things are more equitable. So that's one question.
Let's just stick to one question. Okay. So who would like to start with that? Yeah. Go ahead, yeah.
Okay, sure. I think basically you're right that basically we may be having the best of policies. First of all, having a policy and adding a gender lens to a policy is something which is a big milestone. But then another milestone is that you may be having a policy, but then what about the implementation of that policy? So there's a challenge, absolutely. I'm sure I can definitely talk about Pakistan, that yes, there is a challenge in terms of implementing of that policy. The third is, of course, the reason could be, as I think that was your question, was the ability of, or the capacity of the institutions to be able to implement that reform package, the implementation. That again is something which is also a challenge. Some of our programs in Pakistan, they do address. We have a program called Gender Equality Program, and that program actually it focuses primarily on violence against women. But in addition to that, it also works in terms of educating women in terms of the whatever rights they have, some of the legal aspects, what are the laws that are favoring women and all that. But of course, enforcement of a law is a problem. And that's where, of course, we are trying to, with some of our ongoing interventions and some of our future interventions, we are focusing to address those, but it's definitely a big challenge, and I mean, we are trying our level best to address that challenge. But yes, you're right that there's a challenge there.
So in terms of social and cultural transformation, I think we should understand that it takes decades for anywhere for cultural and social change to actually take place. In Afghanistan, for example, Women for Afghan Women, we do have a program, awareness raising program, that we go to provinces. The organization is working on gender-based violence. And while we help the victims, we know that the cause of this is actually the men who are the perpetrators. So we do gender awareness raising programs, and I think with that we hope that change can happen. But social and cultural change is a whole package. You have to build the foundations as people get more educated, more aware about and incorporate more of civil laws, learn about it, know about it, and the institutions are in place to implement that. Social change comes about. And we are hoping to do a program specifically for men to work on women's rights, and do a men's awareness program in general. That's something we are exploring now through Women for Afghan Women.
Thank you. That's interesting. Yeah.
Oh, well, as the emphasis that I would place in a lot of my remarks on particularly the roles of female empowerment and development and improvement in Afghanistan and Pakistan, I focus on that largely because that was the subject of discussion. But more broadly, particularly in Afghanistan and Pakistan, we in USAID tend to focus on areas for general sound sustainable development. So it isn't necessarily economic as such, though that does tend to be an underlying factor behind it. For Pakistan specifically, there are 5 different sectors that we tend to focus on, which is economic development, but largely that's through through agricultural development, better processes, better fertilization systems, that sort of thing, for higher crop yields, which is for both more food to be able to sell, but also higher quality, higher nutritional levels of food to be consumed domestically, which also relates to a separate area of financing that we promote, which is for general public health, for reproductive health, but also for higher nutritional intake for children in order to prevent neurological stunting before the age of 5, because that leads to better economic opportunities, better educational capability, because if you eat better when you're younger, you're a better student when you're older. Energy, as I mentioned beforehand, there's been a series of different dam projects, wind and solar, hydroelectric power systems that have been put in place. Governance, which is more broadly about transparency, access, best practices at both the local and the national level. And then finally, stabilization, which is primarily in the border areas in North Waziristan. But these are in places where there's been activity on the part of the Pakistani government stabilization on the part of USAID and one of its arms, OTI, the Office of Transition Initiatives, goes in to help for local reconstruction, stabilization efforts in the wake of military activities on the part of the Pakistani government. So it's not purely economic development as a means of then leading to empowerment of women, though that is there. It's just that was sort of the focus of what we were talking about.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So I think the point you raised is a very good one, that, whenever you're talking about well-being and advancements or reduction in discrimination, we're talking about a whole nested ecology, if you like, of factors here, from the individual through the family right up to the social level. So all those factors holistically have to be engaged. You can't just work on scholarships for girls without, of course, impinging on their families, or having safe transport, or having jobs where then women will be accepted. So I think you're absolutely right to draw attention to this, complex, multifactorial set of issues. So it's a very important point that you raised. Any other questions? Oh, right. Yeah. Hang on, there's a mic coming. Well, they may not be able to hear you, so you better have it. Just introduce yourself briefly.
So my name is Gul, and I came from north part of Pakistan. And my concern has been, especially in development and over my observation, is based on that. My question towards especially USAID is, what are your strategies to prevent backlashes of your efforts and interventions? I know there are very wonderful interventions in my area, especially in my district. There is like 75% girls, they go to school. There are higher literacy, everything is there for girls, but with that, there is 2 to 6 women are being, especially educated girls, are being killed based on basis of honor killing. So, from the government as well as from all international NGOs, often they come, they do, but this element is missing. What those women are going to suffer after this so-called empowerment or whatever that is.
Thank you.
Well, I think it's both paired between myself and my USAID colleague from Pakistan who works at the mission, or between the two of us. I can say that USAID, I'll just speak to her. USAID is quite conscious of there are ripples whenever you do anything, and making sure that in attempting to do good, you don't magnify the problem you're attempting to help address. And so we try to get local buy-in, government buy-in, meeting with community leaders and things like that to make sure that whatever improvement that we attempt to promote doesn't in fact inflame passions to make it worse. We're quite conscientious about that, particularly in Pakistan and in areas that may be more resistant or where traditions are much stronger. But I will defer to my colleague with more direct experience in this regard.
Yeah. Just to add to what Dan has said, that basically we, for the last some years, we have tried to actually really, first of all, respond to the need. One, work very closely with the government, as Dan has said, and we actually building institutions of the capacities of the local institution is a very important cross-cutting theme in all the 5 thematic areas that Dan spoke, the 5 thematic areas where we prefer. And it's easier said than done. Again, there are challenges, as you mentioned, particularly the area where you come from. But again, we are sort of heading towards the right direction, and we think that there have been some success stories whereby if you build the capacities of a local institutions in a certain way so that you leave a legacy behind. So that's something that we are trying to do, and there are quite a few, if you're talking about, of course, particularly the gender aspect, there are quite a few local community-based organizations and local and nationwide non-governmental organizations who are actually also some of the projects that have ended, but the activities are still continuing, because capacities, once you build the institutions, when you create, even when the funding ends, they continue to exist. So we are very conscious about that fact.
I want to make a comment on that. So my organization receives most funding from the U.S. Department of State, actually. And and there are over 600 Afghan nationals, mostly women, who work in all our centers or employed inside Afghanistan. And these employees get death threats often. A week ago, our center in Kunduz, who actually dealt with the case of this 10-year-old girl and sent the blood to prison, it got everyone knows in Afghanistan about it as well. So we had to receive, the security came to us and said, you've become on the top 2 list of, making the top 2 in the Taliban's list, target list. So please be careful, and we had to close down our office in Kunduz, but temporarily for 2 weeks, and we are looking for some emergency ways of relocating in a different location within there and transferring our clients to other places. So we are always cautious of this, that this is something that does happen. All our staffers get security, private cars that looks like a normal car take us to work. When I go there, I'm extremely careful how I go around. So this is, but there are these women who are willing to take this risk. I wouldn't give up this job for anything. I would still go to Afghanistan, and I have just an Afghan passport. I've been here for 10 years so that I can keep going there. It's when you really want to have change, there are women, there are people who must take this risk, be on the front lines. Change is never easy. Even in this country, when women got the right to vote, you had women going on hunger strikes, they went to prison. There are always these kinds of dangers. But you have to just moving forward and know that there is the risk.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the great topics and excellent
Yeah, you
conversations.
just have-
Oh, my name is Arturo Reynoso. I'm independent, so I can ask questions and
Go ahead.
not have any consequences to that. If we know correctly that USAID was Kennedy's baby, and the background of that was basically to actually promote commerce and democracy, arguably. When we think about democracy, we think US-style democracy, which is questionable here in this country, really. And we go back to the Cold War, and we have a place like Afghanistan that eventually got under the Russian control and things like that. And then we get the Taliban once the Russians leave, and there's some questions about the origins of the Taliban and how they were funded. My sense is that they were funded to fight the Russians by US funds. So when I think about this now, the laudable goal of empowering women is fantastic. But I guess I reacted to your investment with great calculations, wording. What is behind this empowerment? And that is the challenge.
Thank you. So Dan, I think this is...
I guess. Well, there are entire libraries out there that can address the origins of various political movements around this globe and what the intentions of the United States government or other governments were behind them. I can only speak as to what the role we have now and the mandate that I have been ordered to help carry out from the United States government generally, but USAID writ small. And it is to promote sound, sensible, and sustainable human development. And that's in terms of education, in terms of economic development, in the general sense of people being able to afford a living, better health, and empowerment of women. That's quite explicit in what USAID does, and especially under the leadership of Dr. Shah, who is a physician, actually, and came out of the Gates Foundation. So he comes by this honestly. I don't know if I can really comment one way or another about origins of who came from where. As far as the terms calculation, perhaps that seems, no, I know, but when I say calculation, perhaps a better way to express it is a reasoned and thoughtful approach as to where we can do the most good with the money that we have. not calculation in terms of gain, is a better way of expressing it.
Thank you. Yeah, any other questions? I guess we have time for one more quick question. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Casey. I'm a surgeon just north of Toronto. I'm here doing an MPH degree, Master's in Public Health. I do global work in gender-based violence, specifically around surgical care of women who are survivors of violence. Pakistan and Afghanistan have been two areas that have been harder for us to access in terms of health. And I just wondered if you had a feeling, a lot of the violence in countries like this are underreported, so we really don't understand how big of an issue it is. And Dan spoke about the domestic violence shelters being established, and I just wondered through those efforts or others whether we have a feeling whether gender-based violence is getting better or worse from an inside source and not just what is being streamed out for us to hear, which traditionally has been gross underestimate.
Well, I'll speak briefly because this is something that my colleagues could probably speak more directly to. All I can say is there are almost certainly statistics that we could bring to bear. If you like, once this is done, I will put you together with my colleague because he can give you some of the stats we've been able to gather from this and regarding this particular issue. This is Taha, so once we're done, we're going to put you together, and then I'll defer to.
So, Kanwal.
Yes. Basically, with regard to your question of whether violence is underreported or not, according to a recent study, 90% of the Pakistani women face some kind of a violence through, during their life period. The violence could be physical or mental or whatever. So there are like various forms or harassment or any kind of harassment. So that's there. As far as the stuff that whether it's increasing or not, basically the assessment is that, and that's my view also, that basically the cases of violence have always been there. It's just that recently people have started talking about it, right? Because we see a movement where there are international agencies like us, others who are sort of there to sort of support, fund. There are very powerful civil society organizations in some countries. The media is very powerful. So anytime anything happens, also in case of Pakistan, in case a woman is raped or a woman is sort of has any physical or other problems, the media reaches there, and that's how they do it. So many years ago, if you recall, it was a kind of a taboo. People won't talk about it because they thought it was humiliating, further humiliation, but now people have started talking about it. So we have some numbers as far as that is concerned. One of the programs that we have, and of course Taha can later on give you more information on that, is called Gender Equality, and that is exclusively addressing violence. Some of our other programs, there we are actually setting up centers where women can actually report the cases, and that NGO, a very powerful, very good NGO in Pakistan which works on women issues actually, they not only give them some rehabilitation, but if there are any problems, they connect them to health services and try and improve their state of affairs. So that is something that we are trying to do, but there are other ways of addressing violence, indirect ways also. For instance, if a woman is economically empowered, right? So the probability is that she will be able to actually maybe resist some of the violence. The probability is there. I'm not saying that it will be done and that's something that the research is done by agencies like Oxfam and others. In case of Pakistan, they prove. But so we are actually addressing that subject, and it is easier said than done. Now you see a lot of reports, 90% and all that. So that's part of our program.
So in terms of the reports in Afghanistan, collecting data, especially on this issue, is a challenge. And I'm not aware of data, especially from a few years ago, to compare. It's not really there. But from experience of working with this organization that's addressing gender-based violence, the cases, it was, whether it has increased or decreased, it was always there, and I completely agree that it wasn't talked about. For example, in Herat province, there were more cases of women burning themselves, and now we see that that's not happening much. In Badakhshan province and Kokcha River, we had a lot of women drowning themselves in that river. And a lot of them just died a silent death. No one followed up really. But those cases are decreasing, the reporting talking about gender violence, we see that more people are seeking help, more people are coming to organizations, and then you think that, oh, it has increased, right? Because more people are talking about it. Yeah, but that's...
Okay, well, thank you. We've come to the end of our time. Fantastic comments. Thank you so much, all three of you, for joining us and really enlightening us. And good luck as you go forward in your really important work. Thank you.
If anyone else wants brochures about Women for Afghan Women, I have more, so please ask me.
Forgive us for having to depart. We have another event elsewhere that we must get to. Otherwise, we would stay and be happy to take other questions. But thank you so much for having me.